Tragedy in Puerto Rico as an explosion rips through the capital city, San Juan.
The blast threw debris across the street, upended parked cars.
Confusion in Colorado as a routine demolition seems to go off course.
We were all looking around, wondering what was next. I was like, oh man, they've got to get it this time.
In California, earthquakes threaten an iconic city skyline.
We're finding broken welds and bolts. At that point, we had a real problem.
And in New Zealand, a bridge collapse sparks a desperate rescue mission.
And you could see the bridge sticking up in the air. We heard the rumours that a bus had gone down.
With big builds, even the smallest fail can trigger a huge disaster. From miscalculations to misunderstandings, or just plain bad luck. These catastrophes are every engineer's worst nightmare. As cities grow bigger, the infrastructure beneath them becomes ever more complex. But just one problem in those subterranean systems can lead to devastation. Like this disaster in Puerto Rico that rocked the capital, San Juan.
Pues se escuchó una explosión, pero bien rara, bien profunda, como si fuera un trueno dentro de la tierra.
As a blast wave ripped through a busy shopping complex.
Cuando yo me paré ahí, yo sabía que mi papá estaba ahí adentro.
Leaving engineers with a mystery. Just what had triggered the massive explosion? San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, was founded more than 500 years ago. And the historic seaport has much to offer locals and tourists alike.
Like all capital cities, people visit San Juan for history, culture and entertainment, as well as a wide selection of retail outlets.
And this area, Rio Pedra, has long been known for its many shops. Elvis Rodriguez Ortega is a local pastor.
El área es muy famosa, reconocida y visitada. Llena todo el tiempo. O sea, ya después de las 10 de la mañana esto se llenaba y se llena todavía de gente viniendo a comprar.
All kinds of shops are found here, and for many years, on the corner of the main street, several retailers were found under one roof.
Now home to a local supermarket, this corner was once occupied by the headquarters of a popular record, jewelry and shoe store. The sixth-floor building included 4 levels of office and storage space, located on top of a retail outlet at the street level.
O sea, que es una tienda bien famosa. Esta tienda de envuelto y cuidar es bien famosa porque te vende los zapatos de la escuela.
To ensure the shelves never went empty, there was a huge basement beneath the building dedicated to storing shoes. For years, the tower was a landmark for the district. But in 1996, a shocking event would bring the structure to its knees. November the 21st, early Thursday morning. Jorge Ibanez Sanchez and his father arrived at the tower to carry out routine air conditioning maintenance.
El día que entramos a la tienda a trabajar, pues yo no sentí ninguna peste a gas. Nosotros entramos a las 6:30 de la mañana al edificio, nos dividíamos, entrábamos a los diferentes pisos. Mi papá se encargaba de 2 o 3 pisos y yo me encargaba de 2.
At 8 a.m., Jorge had finished his projects when staff began arriving for work at the headquarters and mentioned a smell coming from the basement. Jorge was needed at another job nearby, so his father went to investigate the smell from downstairs.
Ya mi papá se encargaba del sótano y mezanín y me fui a hacer otros trabajos para otras tiendas.
Shortly after, Pastor Ortega was in the street when a noise stopped him in his tracks.
Cuando Cuando iba caminando, pues se escuchó una explosión, pero bien rara, bien profunda, como si fuera un trueno dentro de la tierra.
The six-story tower had been rocked by a massive blast. Already at the other work site, Jorge still felt the shockwave.
Cuando se sintió la explosión, yo corrí a ver qué, porque se entendía que era como un transformador que había explotado. Cuando yo corrí a la esquina, me encuentro el polvorín que me empieza a dar en la cara.
The powder was what remained of the tower, which had been devastated.
The blast threw debris across the street, upended parked cars and hurled chunks of concrete into the buildings opposite.
Yo sabía que mi papá estaba ahí adentro. Ahí pues, en ese momento, me dio un shock. Tuve, entiendo yo, como 10 minutos que no pude reaccionar.
No hubo fuego, sino el polvorín de las estructuras llenó esta área completa. Entonces, yo estaba con un temor tan grande.
First responders soon arrived, helping the wounded and searching for survivors.
Pero no tuve ninguna reacción de qué pudo haber sido. Llegó un amigo mío que me saca.
The major rescue effort went on for days. 11 people were pulled from the wreckage, injured yet alive. But as the rescue turned to a recovery operation, Jorge discovered his father hadn't made it.
Vi personas que estuvieron en la tienda, pero que salieron. Allí es donde me entero de dónde estaba mi papá.
The recovery continued for weeks. 15 victims were found in the rubble, Jorge's father among them.
Esto me quitó a mi papá. No tengo más nada que decir sobre eso.
In total, 69 people were injured, and 33 more lost their lives in one of the worst disasters in the island's history.
Tanta gente importante, muertos, familiares dolidos, familiares marcados para toda la vida. Sabe que es un sentido de culpa, pero yo me siento triste por toda la gente que murieron ese día, todas las que vi.
The blast tore the heart out of the district. Survivors and victims' loved ones soon began to demand answers. Why had this quiet Thursday morning turned to tragedy? Federal investigators immediately began to scour the wreckage for clues. Lab testing on the debris revealed that it was a gas explosion. One possible cause was sewer gas collecting in the basement from waste pipes that ran beside the store.
Sewer gas, like natural gas, is mostly made up of methane and lighter than air. In high enough concentrations, it can be highly explosive.
But investigators found evidence in the storage basement that ruled out methane. The imprint of shoes on the ceiling. Chemical engineer J. Patrick Abulencia examined the report.
Because of the way the explosion happened, shoes were being exploded in the upward direction in such a way that really suggests that the explosion came from below rather than above.
With lighter-than-air methane, the blast would have pushed down on the shoes. But the marks on the ceiling proved they had been blasted upwards, so investigators looked to a heavier gas. And they found it, in a fuel source that was used in the area, propane.
The propane will tend to go into low-lying areas like basements, crevices, and soil. And in this particular case, the propane was able to enter the basement of the store.
A propane explosion would explain the marks on the ceiling. The next question was, where had it come from? Records showed an unknown pipe had been found 5 years earlier, during the installation of a water main.
When laying the new water pipe, workers found a plastic pipe that wasn't on any maps. They simply dug under it, laid the water pipe, and backfilled the hole.
This unknown pipe carried propane, and investigators concluded that it must have failed due to damage sustained during construction work, lack of support, or some other means.
The pipe was able to fracture and cause a leak of the propane in the surrounding areas.
The denser-than-air propane flowed downhill and pooled in the basement, before an unsourced spark ignited it, causing the massive blast.
Desgraciadamente, mató a tanta gente. Pues analicen si vuelve una situación para que esas desgracias no vuelvan a suceder.
In the aftermath of the disaster, federal authorities implemented a program to identify undocumented pipework across Puerto Rico. A job that is easier than ever before thanks to new technology.
With the improvement in location technology with respect to where gas lines are, future builders know where exactly not to dig.
While every effort is being made to prevent a similar disaster, those who experienced this tragedy firsthand will never forget it.
Pues no fue con malicia, fue un accidente. 20 y pico de años y esto como si hubiese sido ayer.
Big engineering is constantly evolving thanks to new technologies and cutting-edge techniques. But sometimes innovation introduces problems of its own. Like this story in California, where a major earthquake threatened a world-famous skyline.
This wasn't just one skyscraper. Dozens of towers were at risk of collapse.
A critical problem that went unnoticed for decades.
It's a very violent type of fracture. The strength of the building is pretty much gone.
When you find out that many buildings are potentially compromised, it's scary.
Triggering a race to find a solution.
You would have had the buildings pulverized by the shaking of the ground.
911. There's a hell of an earthquake, and we've got windows and everything have fallen out.
This sounds like something from a disaster movie, but it's very real.
San Francisco, California, the city by the bay, is famous for stunning scenery, big business, and unusually shaky ground. John King is a local journalist.
Every big city has natural threats it has to worry about, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever. But part of what gives San Francisco its particular charge is that huge earthquakes can strike at any second with no notice at all.
Over a century ago, residents witnessed firsthand that the area is prone to high-magnitude earthquakes. When the post-gold rush population experienced a once-in-a-lifetime natural disaster.
In 1906, San Francisco was struck by a massive earthquake. The ground shook violently for nearly a minute, destroying buildings and triggering devastating fires across the city.
The official death toll was around 700 people, but it's believed to be significantly higher.
Between the violent shaking and the raging fires, much of the city was leveled. But amid the devastation, there was a crucial lesson for the construction industry. Structural engineer Jim Malley explains.
In the 1906 earthquake, the major buildings in San Francisco that seemed to do best and survive the earthquake the best were steel-framed buildings.
Engineers noticed that steel buildings had performed significantly better than brick or stone, partly because steel isn't as vulnerable to fire, but also because steel can flex. It didn't get shaken apart like its more solid neighbors.
That gave engineers for many years the impression or the feeling that steel buildings could be, really good performers in earthquakes.
Although earthquake-prone San Francisco was slower to grow skywards than Manhattan and Chicago, over the following decades, its skyline started to take shape. Key to that boom was a structural system known as the steel moment frame.
It's just a series of beams and columns. The beams, horizontal members that hold up the floors. They carry the loads to the columns that carry it down to the foundation.
The goal is for the structure to move, absorbing the shaking. Although it might suffer damage, it shouldn't collapse.
In an earthquake, it sort of leans over a little bit and creates forces in the connections between the beams and columns, which is really the most important part of any steel frame.
For decades, beam-to-column connections in steel moment frame structures were secured with rivets or bolts. But in the 1960s, welds replaced bolts and rivets, fusing the vast steel members together. The structures were as flexible as before, but the joints were now stronger and more earthquake-proof.
This connection was probably used widely between the early 1960s and the mid-1990s in California for office buildings, hospitals, university buildings.
Dozens of skyscrapers were built this way, from the iconic pyramid that was for a long time the city's tallest tower, to others lining Market Street and beyond.
With these welded connections, many engineers believed the structures were invulnerable to earthquake-induced collapse. At least that was the theory.
In the late 1980s, Mother Nature was about to put that theory to the test. San Francisco, California, October the 17th, 1989.
We're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. 911. There's a hell of an earthquake, and we've got windows and everything else falling out.
Just after 5 p.m., the San Andreas fault shifted, triggering a massive earthquake.
238, we have a major injury accident, Cypress and West Grandview. They're advising major injuries.
At the time, Sappho Ferris was homesick from school.
And we're like, oh, earthquake, you know, shaky, shaky, haha. We'll just write it out like you always do. But then it kept going, and it got stronger.
The earthquake lasted 15 seconds. It just came and went, boom. But in the course of that, it left all this damage in its wake. One section of the Bay Bridge snapped and fell, but then also you had an entire freeway collapse in Oakland.
More than 60 people died and thousands were injured.
It was kind of like, what's going to happen next? There's aftershocks. Was this a pre-shock to a bigger one? How long will it take for things to get back to normal?
The devastation was widespread, and yet the steel-framed San Francisco skyline emerged unscathed. It would take another natural disaster, 5 years later and hundreds of kilometers away, to reveal a key vulnerability in its towers. 4:30 in the morning on January the 17th, 1994. The citizens of LA's San Fernando Valley were jolted from their sleep by the North Ridge earthquake.
With a magnitude of 6.7, the North Ridge event ranks as a moderate earthquake, but it produced some of the strongest ground movements ever recorded in the US.
Damage was documented over 80 kilometers from the epicenter. More than 1,000 people were seriously injured, and tragically, around 60 died. As the nation mourned, engineers inspecting LA's largest structures for damage made a chilling discovery in buildings with the supposedly earthquake-proof steel moment frame.
Many of these buildings look fine from the outside, but when engineers inspected the welds between the beams and columns, they found serious cracks.
Word quickly spread among structural engineers like Jim Malley.
There were reports from engineers saying, you know, we're finding broken welds and bolts. A couple months after the earthquake, there was a major meeting showing pictures, and we knew that at that point we had a real problem.
This technique had been used for decades on hundreds of structures across California. Once the North Ridge earthquake revealed that there was a problem, the question was, what to do now?
In the immediate aftermath, federal agencies and engineering institutions joined forces to understand what had caused the North Ridge damage. Jim Malley was on the investigation team.
And that did then lead to Federal Emergency Management Agency coming forward with a research funding to study what happened and why, and how we could improve design to avoid it in the future.
And what they discovered was shocking.
In an earthquake, Welded steel moment frame structures had an Achilles heel, where the beams and the columns connected.
It turns out the change from bolts and rivets to welds in the 1960s had introduced a weakness.
What happens when the earthquake hits, it creates what we call a tension force on this portion of the beam. So it basically tries to pull it away from the column, and it pulled it away in such a manner that it actually fractured through the weld. So it's a very violent type of fracture. That was very concerning because now what you thought you had as far as the strength of the building is now pretty much gone.
This problem, highlighted by the LA inspections, was common in welded steel frames built throughout California from 1964 to 1989. Alarming news for experts familiar with San Francisco's skyline.
So many of the large towers that are in San Francisco's financial district, they were built exactly during that time. Kind of, okay, but what's in there? What could be the problem?
While inspections continued in LA, Jim and the team also turned their attention to San Francisco's steel towers, looking for previously undetected damage from the Loma Prieta earthquake 5 years earlier.
We know that these buildings may get shaken just as hard as the buildings in Northridge, so we would expect similar types of damage to occur.
And yet, inspections revealed cracking attributed to San Francisco's Loma Prieta quake was present in only 6 towers. The shaking just hadn't been violent enough to damage the buildings further. The city had been lucky, but with no guarantees for the future, San Francisco needed a fix. Engineers started looking for solutions. Step 1 was to better understand why the joints were failing. So investigators began lab testing.
So what we would do would be to simulate similar connections, weld it the same way they would have welded it in the field, and then brought it into the laboratory and then pushed on it to create similar force patterns as the earthquake would have done.
They discovered that the problem was directly related to the challenges of welding the joints.
To complete these crucial connections, the welder would sit on the beam itself, working their way along the joint, which would mean leaning over or reaching around tricky angles.
This forced welders already working in challenging conditions to stop and start more often than those in a controlled location.
The trouble is, each time they did, there was a risk of a defect in the weld.
A defect that decades later could crack in an earthquake. Once the root cause was understood, engineers started working on solutions, from adding strengthening plates to completely replacing the welds. A long-term and expensive retrofit program that continues to this day.
There's not a limitless spigot of money to fix them. You can't say, oh, 30 towers have to be retrofitted and have it magically happen. The other thing is, how do you do it? How do you get into the bones of the building to do the upgrades that are needed in something of that scale?
While the seemingly never-ending fix continues, Californians hope that the next big one isn't just around the corner.
I do worry about what could happen to the city, people in the city, if another earthquake were to happen.
Although many of the towers would likely withstand something as powerful as the monumental 1906 earthquake, eventually something much stronger will come along.
Structural engineers on the West Coast, we think about earthquakes every day. We have learned and we have improved our procedures, developed better approaches that we are confident are going to be more resilient in the next earthquake. And we know that the risk is out there. It may not happen for another 300-400 years, right? But it could happen tomorrow, and we have no way of telling.
Engineering knowledge and understanding is constantly evolving. As problems reveal themselves, it's vital that engineers learn lessons on how to do things differently in the future to make our structures safer.
Great feats of engineering depend on a robust design that's built to last. But when their time is up, that strength can be a problem for demolition crews. Like this catastrophe in Colorado, as spectators gathered to watch a historic factory come down.
People thought they would see this huge thing just crumble all at once like we see in the movies.
After not one, not two, but 3 blasts, sections were still standing, leaving the crowd confused.
We all had an idea in our head of what we were going to see, and it turned out to be something completely different.
The big question, was this carefully planned, or had something gone terribly wrong?
Colorado. While the western side of the state is dominated by the mighty Rocky Mountains, to the east lies an endless flat landscape, known as the Eastern Plains, that's ideal for ranching. Jacob White grew up here.
When you wake up in the morning, you're going out and feeding the horses. You're taking care of the agriculture because that's what you need to run a farm. It's definitely always been hard work, you know, nose to the grindstone.
One staple crop has dominated the area for around 100 years, the sugar beet. Nina Lewis is a long-time Plains resident.
Sugar beets, which is a major crop here in Colorado. And so it's a large underground root, and it is shaped just like this. And then it has this beautiful greenery that comes out of the ground. And sugar beets can get pretty darn big.
These beets don't reach the kitchen table in this form. Instead, they are grown for their high natural sugar content.
We've all heard of sugar cane, but the sweet crystals can also be made from the sugar beet. And although it might look like a turnip, the end product is virtually identical, whether refined from cane or beet.
These bulbous roots are an excellent source of sugar, but once they're harvested, they biodegrade quickly and need to be processed as soon as possible. To turn the beet into sugar fresh from the fields, giant factories sprang up around the small farming communities, including one near Nina's hometown of Eaton.
The sugar beet factory was a huge thing in the town. It was so large, it was so beautifully built. The red brick in it, it was such a monster of a building, you couldn't miss it.
This local landmark could process over 600 tons of beets into granulated sugar each day, for export all over the US. But it all came to an end with a change to a national regulation, which had long favoured domestic sugar producers.
The Sugar Act protected sugar production profits in the US, but it was revoked in 1974, which all but killed off these small-town factories.
Just 2 years after the act was revoked, the factory closed its doors, and over the decades became a dangerous playground for children like Jacob.
We spent a lot of time running around in there as kids. It was always a really cool place to be. Being inside there with my friends, playing games and climbing on things, those are some of my fondest memories for sure.
By 2013, this local landmark had become unstable, and authorities decided to demolish it.
It was really beaten to pieces, you know, bricks laying about everywhere. On the inside, it was really just the bare bones. You know, you had kind of some concrete flooring, but there were holes in everything.
Although dilapidated, the vast structure had stood strong for 100 years.
Engineers build structures to last, so demolishing them is never easy.
There are 2 main methods, either chewing them from the top down with massive machines or using explosives to bring them down in a controlled implosion.
Like any massive structure in a remote location, the sugar factory was a perfect candidate for demolition by controlled implosion, at least in theory. May the 5th, early in the morning, the sugar factory's time had finally come. Jacob and Nina joined a crowd of residents in a safe zone to watch the show.
People just thought that they would see this huge thing just crumble all at once like we see in the movies.
There was a big buzz, you know, everybody was waiting for the moment, everybody was waiting for the boom.
At 8 a.m., the charges were blown.
You can see the smoke, and then the water tower just kind of laid down on top of the building. And then we all just sat there anxiously waiting because that building did not come down. So then what next?
In a cloud of brick dust, most of the building was still standing.
I was pretty perplexed when just the center came down, and I think everyone around me was. We were all looking around, wondering what was next, or if that was a fail, or, you know, nobody was sure.
We sat for quite a while before we had any information that things did not go as planned.
I think it maybe took an hour after the first blast to get word through the crowd that, okay, there is going to be more.
Around 1 p.m., engineers were ready to try again.
So with the second blast, I was like, oh man, they've got to get it this time.
And yet, after the dust settled, towering remains at each end of the factory were still standing. The third time would, hopefully, be the charm. It had taken the better part of a day and 3 detonations, and yet parts of the massive structure were still left standing.
We all had an idea in our head of what we were going to see. In my mind, yeah, I thought, you know, I would hear maybe 1 or 2 blasts and that the whole building would just kind of collapse in on itself. And it turned out to be something completely different.
Even after that third, there was still this section here on the north end that did not come down.
The burning question was, why had it been such a challenge? According to some reports, the answer could be simple. The town had asked demolition crews to use conservative amounts of explosives.
Demolition with explosives is always tricky. You have to consider the amount of explosive, which bits of structure need to be destroyed, and sometimes the result can be unexpected.
This conservative use of explosives could have left key structural elements intact, resulting in a partial collapse rather than a total takedown.
If you use too little explosive, the structure might not fall completely. It's known as a stand-up.
Although frustrating, a stand-up is far preferable to an excessively large explosion, which could hurl debris towards spectators with potentially fatal consequences. The crowd may have been confused, but they were safe. There were no injuries, and most of the building was taken down. So the demolition crew had safely carried out the blast.
For me personally, it was almost kind of a ha-ha. You guys didn't succeed. Maybe this thing shouldn't come down, even though we're too late at this point. But you're taking down a building that is so well built and has been here for 100+ years.
By the end of the day, it was clear that the best solution was to remove the remaining structure using brute force.
It took them months to take that down with large equipment. They just would take a bucket and they would hit the brick and let the brick crumble and get to a safe spot and then do it again.
Within a year, new businesses began to occupy the area and the community was revitalized.
I do miss the old building so much, but it is alive and it's very, very active over here.
Just like the site, Eaton itself seems to be looking to the future.
It's kind of cool to come back here, and there's been a lot of growth and expansion over the last few years. So Eaton is thriving. It's growing a lot.
With big structures, engineers build strong to withstand the power of Mother Nature. If there's any vulnerability, the elements will exploit it. Like this disaster in New Zealand, as a vital highway bridge crumbled into the water below.
The most important road in New Zealand had been cut in half,
sparking a struggle to find survivors.
We heard the rumours that a bus had gone down. I got in the water and started making the way as best I could.
Leaving engineers in a race against time to reconnect the nation. Zealand is one of the largest island countries on Earth. For decades, one very long road has connected major northern cities like Auckland and Wellington, with Bluff in the far south, State Highway 1. Anthony Rook is a highways engineer.
It's a highway of national significance, so it's of vital importance for sort of interregional transport, movement of freight, so it's got huge economic benefit.
Construction began on the rugged North Island in the mid-20th century.
At the time, building this coast-to-coast highway across the North Island's unforgiving terrain was a massive engineering challenge.
The problem wasn't just the uneven ground. Multiple waterways had to be bridged too. One of the most challenging crossings was over the Rangitikei River, near the town of Bulls.
The Rangitikei River is one of the longest in New Zealand, with waters that wander across a wide gravel bed from the central mountains south to the Tasman Sea.
Long before State Highway 1 was built, New Zealanders were using timber bridges to cross the river, but they never lasted long.
The first crossing was constructed in 1873, only to be washed away about 24 years later in the Great Flood of 1897. That event actually washed out all 6 crossings of the Rangitikei River that were in place at the time.
In the 1940s, engineers building the state highway knew that this one had to stand the test of time. So they turned to a much more robust bridge, using concrete and steel.
Engineers used 12 concrete piers spread evenly across the riverbed to support the bridge.
The bridge was pretty much in the form that we see here. It comprises a reinforced concrete deck supported on 5 steel plate girders. And those plate girders are continuous across the piers every other span.
The bridge opened in 1949, and engineers believed it would stand up to anything that nature could deal out. But more than 2 decades later, a harsh winter would prove them wrong. Friday, June the 15th, 1973, just outside the town of Bulls. During a wet, windy afternoon, John Whitehead, then 17, was looking forward to the weekend.
I finished work, travelling home. It'd been raining a lot, heavy rain because the river was in such high in flood.
Coming over a rise, John was greeted by a catastrophe. The Rangitikei Bridge was down.
The road and the bridge, there it is, sticking up in the air. It's like a shock, and putting it all together in my head.
John stopped short of the drop, but when he stepped out, he was in for another shock.
I walked to the edge and I'm going, oh my God, there's a part of a bus there. There's a person in the water, and I thought straight away he'll be in trouble.
To everyone's relief, the bus driver had dropped off his passengers before heading on to the bridge, and his was the only vehicle that went down in the collapse. John and another witness waded into the icy river, trying to rescue the injured bus driver.
I got in the water and started making my way as best I could. I quickly lost the bottom.
Debris from the icy flood was battering the rescuers as they located and attempted to rescue the driver.
Basically, just put my arm around the bus driver, and then we endeavoured to get through the wood and trees and branches and without being pushed under.
The rescue mission was becoming desperate, but as first responders arrived, the 3 men reached the shore.
I was totally exhausted, and of course the bus driver was injured. So then, with the help of the people that were on shore, lifted the bus driver out, and both us rescuers managed to climb out.
Miraculously, the disaster hadn't claimed any lives, but the crucially important State Highway 1 was sliced in 2.
Critical piece of infrastructure, it's gone down. Following the collapse, obviously, main focus was on reinstatement of access.
Engineers needed to assess the damage and figure out a solution, but that would take time. For the short term, traffic had to be rerouted.
All state highway traffic in the immediate aftermath was diverted onto local road networks, with the nearest crossing across the Rangitikei being about 12 kilometres upstream.
But in this busy area, traffic couldn't be redirected for long. So engineers came up with an ingenious temporary fix, borrowing technology from the military.
Bailey bridges were invented by the British during World War II as a quick and easy way to build a temporary but strong crossing.
It's an excellent system, very flexible, very versatile. It allows for single lane access to be restored very quickly and relatively cheaply as well.
Within 2 months, the temporary crossing was in place and State Highway 1 was back in action, for now. Meanwhile, engineers had found the source of the collapse, a support known as Pier Q, where the riverbed was 6 meters lower than when the bridge was originally built.
The failure of Pier Q was the ultimate cause, but the reason for Pier Q itself failing was attributed to a combination of effects.
One factor was decades of human intervention with the riverbed.
So they were taking gravel from the bed, upstream and downstream of the bridge. And what that meant over that sustained period of time, the riverbed is lowering from 1945 to 1972, just leading up to the collapse.
This engineered yet unintentional erosion had been going on for years. But during this flood, there was another stroke of bad luck, as debris snagged on a remnant from an earlier bridge beside Pier Q.
Logs, fallen trees, coming down with the water, and that got caught up against the timber pier. That caused a raft to form, and it directed flows at Pier Q at a slightly oblique angle, and it accelerated those flows.
The pier was already more compromised than engineers had ever anticipated. This concentrated erosion was the final straw.
When the first pier washed away, the 2 spans that it supported toppled into the water, knocking over another pier and pulling down another span with it, like a row of dominoes.
Now that engineers understood the complicated cause of the disaster, they went to work on a permanent fix.
They removed the demolished spans from the waterway, just to clear the area up and to give them some clear access.
Most of the bridge was undamaged, so the plan was to rebuild the fallen piers, but significantly stronger than before.
If we look across to this pier here, so we've got 5 columns underneath the original steel beams. That is the outline of your original pier. And as we come down, you can see there's a much wider beam. We've created this reinforced concrete jacket, which extends around the original pier. We've installed 2 new piles, steel and concrete pile encased in a steel cylinder. They go that 15 meters down to the competent rock.
With the new piles going 6 meters deeper than the originals, down into bedrock. The new foundations would stand up to anything the river could throw at them.
From 1973 to 1975, the Ministry of Works proceeded with a program of underpinning the 10 other piers within the width of the river channel itself.
Within 6 months, the work on the new piers was complete, and the vital bridge reopened, to a nationwide sigh of relief.
More than 5 decades later, the redesigned bridge still stands strong, a testament to both problem solving and clever engineering.